Welcome. Tonight's story takes us deep into the shadowed streets of old New Orleans, where beauty, bondage, and a mystery history still refuses to explain collide in one haunting tale. This is the shocking mystery behind the most beautiful slave New Orleans ever knew, a woman whose appearance changed lives, ignited obsession, and left behind questions that still echo through time. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories like this matter to you. Please subscribe, because every video you see here is built on hours of deep research, verified records, and true historical data that rarely gets told. In the 18th and 19th centuries, New Orleans was unlike any other slave society in America. Influenced by French and Spanish rule, the city developed a complex social hierarchy where enslaved people lived under laws different from those in other southern states. Unlike plantation-only systems, New Orleans had urban slavery. Enslaved men and women worked as house servants, artisans, cooks, nurses, and entertainers, often moving freely through the city during the day. This visibility made beauty, talent, and personality far more noticeable and far more dangerous. One of the most disturbing aspects of New Orleans' slave society was the three-tier racial system: white elites at the top, free people of color in the middle, and enslaved Africans at the bottom. Some enslaved women, especially those with lighter skin or striking beauty, were treated differently, not out of kindness, but because they were seen as valuable possessions. Beauty could increase a slave's price, expose them to exploitation, or place them in elite households where power, desire, and control blurred into something far darker. Public markets openly displayed enslaved people, where physical appearance directly affected their worth. Women were inspected, discussed, and judged as commodities. In this environment, an enslaved woman known for extraordinary beauty could become famous, whispered about in salons and slave quarters alike. But this attention did not bring safety. It brought obsession, jealousy, and danger. New Orleans' slave society was a place where law, desire, religion, and cruelty coexisted, creating conditions where a single individual could become both admired and erased from history. This is the world in which the mystery of the most beautiful slave was born, a society that recorded ownership carefully, yet somehow allowed her story to slip into shadows, leaving behind only fragments, rumors, and unanswered questions. Very little about her early life was ever written down, and that silence is part of the mystery itself. Most historians believe she was born into slavery in the early 19th century, likely somewhere in the Deep South, before being brought to New Orleans, a city that was then one of the largest slave markets in America. Enslaved people were treated as property, not as individuals, so records focused on age, physical condition, and market value rather than names, families, or personal histories. This is why her true birth name, parents, and childhood remain unknown. What makes her story stand out is how early observers described her appearance as unusual by the standards of the time. Accounts suggest she had striking features that immediately drew attention in a society obsessed with racial hierarchy and exoticism. In New Orleans, a city shaped by French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean cultures, enslaved women with lighter skin or distinctive beauty were often singled out, fetishized, and subjected to a different, but often more dangerous, form of exploitation. Beauty did not protect them. Instead, it increased their vulnerability. Some oral histories and later retellings claim she may have been the child of an enslaved woman and a powerful white man, an all too common reality in slave societies. If true, this would explain both her appearance and the secrecy surrounding her origins. Such children were rarely acknowledged by their fathers and were often sold away to avoid scandal. Whether this detail is fact or legend, it reflects a broader truth. Her life began in a system built on violence, coercion, and erased identities. By the time she arrived in New Orleans, she was no longer just a person, she was a commodity. Her youth and beauty increased her price, placing her at the center of a brutal economy, where human worth was measured in dollars. This dark beginning sets the foundation for everything that followed, making her later fame, fascination, and mystery even more haunting when viewed against the reality of how her life truly started. Her life changed forever the moment she was placed on the auction block. Slave auctions in New Orleans were not quiet transactions, they were public spectacles designed to squeeze the highest possible profit from human suffering. Buyers examined enslaved people like livestock, checking teeth, skin, posture, and strength. For women, especially young women, the scrutiny was even more invasive. In her case, witnesses later claimed that the crowd fell unnervingly silent when she was presented, as if they were staring at something they were not meant to see. Her beauty, which should have been meaningless in a just world, became a weapon used against her. Auctioneers allegedly emphasized her appearance, hinting at her special qualities, without ever stating them openly. This was a coded language common at the time, understood by wealthy buyers who knew that attractive enslaved women were often purchased for personal exploitation rather than labor. The higher the fascination, the higher the bidding climbed, and so did her price. What makes this moment so disturbing is how it exposes the twisted values of the slave economy. Strength meant productivity, youth meant longevity, and beauty meant power, but not for the enslaved person. It meant control for the buyer. Historical accounts suggest that her final sale price was unusually high, even by New Orleans standards, fueling rumors that she was destined for a life hidden behind closed doors rather than in the open fields or kitchens. As the hammer came down and the sale was finalized, her fate was sealed by strangers who knew nothing about her except what they could see. In that single moment, she lost any remaining chance of anonymity. The auction did not just sell her body. It marked the beginning of her transformation into a legend, a symbol of how slavery could turn human beauty into a form of punishment. After the auction, she disappeared into the private world of New Orleans elite, a world rarely documented, yet central to understanding her suffering. Unlike plantation slavery, urban slavery in New Orleans placed enslaved women inside homes, guest houses, and hidden quarters, where control was more intimate and isolation more complete. She was no longer surrounded by large groups of enslaved people. Instead, she lived under constant watch, her movements measured and her presence tightly managed. Accounts suggest she was kept not as a worker, but as a possession meant to be seen only when desired. Her daily life was shaped by silence, no public labor, no community, and no protection. In such environments, enslaved women were especially vulnerable because abuse could be concealed behind wealth and respectability. What happened inside these private spaces rarely reached official records, leaving only whispers, rumors, and later testimonies to hint at the reality. New Orleans at the time was a city of contradictions: music, culture, and celebration on the surface, and extreme brutality beneath. Enslaved women like her existed at the intersection of obsession and control. Her beauty reportedly brought her gifts, fine clothing, and better living conditions, but these were not privileges. They were tools of ownership, designed to reinforce dependence and erase resistance. Perhaps the most haunting detail is how completely she vanished from public view. Unlike other enslaved people who could be seen in markets or on the streets, she became almost invisible, spoken about more than she was seen. This disappearance fueled curiosity, envy, and dark fascination among those who knew of her existence. In trying to control her, her owners unintentionally created a legend, one born not from freedom or fame, but from confinement and fear. As years passed, her absence from public life only intensified the rumors surrounding her. In a city like New Orleans, where stories travel faster than truth, whispers began to replace facts. People spoke of her in fragments, a woman of extraordinary beauty, kept hidden from the world, a figure glimpsed behind curtains or escorted through back entrances, never allowed to walk freely in daylight. The lack of confirmed information allowed imagination to fill the gaps, and myth quickly wrapped itself around her reality. Some claimed she was protected like a treasure, others insisted she was imprisoned like a secret too dangerous to reveal. Stories exaggerated her beauty until it became almost supernatural, turning her into something more than human in the public mind. This process was not unusual in slave societies. When real lives were erased from records, legends took their place. But in her case, the contrast between invisibility and obsession made the legend grow stronger with time. These rumors served an important psychological role for the society around her. By turning her into a mystery, people avoided confronting the cruelty of her actual condition. It was easier to speak of her as an object of fascination than as a woman trapped by violence and power. Even sympathetic listeners often framed her story as tragic romance rather than systemic abuse, unintentionally softening the horror of slavery. By the time her name, real or invented, circulated widely, she was no longer just an enslaved woman. She had become a symbol of forbidden desire, of wealth's ability to hide cruelty, and of how slavery could consume a person so completely that only a distorted echo of their existence remained. The legend did not free her, but it ensured that her story, however fractured, refused to disappear. Every legend has a moment where silence becomes unbearable, and for her, that moment came when obsession crossed into destruction. Accounts suggest that the intense control over her life, constant surveillance, isolation, and emotional confinement eventually reached a breaking point. Whether through an act of resistance, illness, or violence, something happened that could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. Some versions of the story claim she tried to assert control over her own fate, even in the smallest ways, refusing orders, withdrawing emotionally, or attempting escape. In a system designed to crush individuality, even quiet defiance was dangerous. Others suggest her decline was physical, the result of prolonged stress, mistreatment, and psychological trauma. In slave-holding societies, such suffering was rarely acknowledged as real. Enslaved people were expected to endure endlessly. What is consistent across accounts is the sudden shift in how she was spoken about. The whispers changed tone, from fascination to discomfort, from admiration to fear. Whatever occurred forced her owners and their circle to confront a truth they had tried to ignore. Complete control over another human being often ends in irreversible harm. This turning point marked the collapse of the fantasy that had surrounded her. After this moment, references to her became vague and fragmented. Some said she was sent away, others that she died quietly, her existence too erased to avoid scandal. There were no public records, no funerals, no closure. The absence of an ending is itself part of the tragedy, reflecting how enslaved lives could simply vanish without acknowledgement. Keynote 6 represents the moment where beauty, obsession, and power collided, and something broke. It is the darkest reminder that behind every legend born of slavery lies a human life pushed beyond its limits, often without witness, justice, or remembrance. After the breaking point, she vanished completely. Not just from public view, but from history itself. No confirmed death record, no bill of sale, no newspaper notice. Nothing that could firmly explain what became of her. In a society that documented property carefully, this absence is deeply unsettling. It suggests that her disappearance was not accidental, but deliberate. In slaveholding New Orleans, erasure was a powerful tool. If an enslaved person's existence threatened reputation, wealth, or social standing, the easiest solution was to remove them from the narrative entirely. Some believe she was quietly sold to another city or plantation under a different name, ensuring that no one could trace her story. Others suspect she died under suspicious circumstances and that her death was intentionally concealed to avoid legal or social consequences. The silence surrounding her fate reflects how little value the system placed on enslaved lives. If she suffered or died, it was considered a private matter, not a public loss. There were no memorials, no official mourning, and no accountability. Her humanity was erased in the same way it had been denied from the beginning, through paperwork that reduced people to numbers, or through the complete absence of paperwork at all. Ironically, this disappearance only strengthened her legend. The lack of an ending left room for speculation, fear, and myth. People remembered her not through facts, but through questions. Where did she go? Who made sure she was never spoken of again? What truth was being buried? Keynote 7 exposes one of slavery's most brutal realities. Control did not end with ownership of the body. It extended to ownership of memory. By making her vanish without a trace, the system attempted to claim the final word over her existence. But the mystery itself became an act of resistance, ensuring that her story, though incomplete, could never be fully silenced. As her story passed from whispers to retellings, historians began to question how much of the legend could be proven. The problem was not a lack of interest, but a lack of reliable records. Enslaved women, especially those kept in private households, were rarely documented in ways that preserved their identities. What survives instead are second-hand accounts, oral histories, and later writings colored by sensationalism. Researchers have pointed out that some details attributed to her mirror common patterns found in many enslaved women's lives in New Orleans. Extraordinary beauty, secret confinement, and sudden disappearance were not unique events, but recurring outcomes in a system built on exploitation. Over time, multiple real lives may have been merged into a single, more dramatic narrative, transforming a collective tragedy into one haunting figure. This raises an uncomfortable question: was she a single individual, or a symbolic representation created by society to avoid confronting widespread abuse? The uncertainty does not weaken the story. It strengthens its historical importance. Even if certain elements were exaggerated, the conditions that made such a story believable were very real and well documented. Some historians argue that focusing too narrowly on proving or disproving her existence risks missing the larger truth. Slavery thrived on secrecy, especially in cases involving sexual exploitation. The absence of evidence may itself be evidence of intentional concealment, reminding us that official records often reflect the interests of the powerful, not the suffering of the oppressed. Keynote 8 challenges the audience to rethink what truth means in historical storytelling. When voices are silenced and lives are erased, myth becomes a survival mechanism, a way for forgotten people to remain present in memory. Whether entirely factual or partially symbolic, her story exposes realities that written records were designed to hide, making the legend historically meaningful, even in its uncertainty. Beyond the mystery of who she was or what ultimately happened to her, her story exposes the deepest truths about the system of slavery itself. Slavery was not only about forced labor, it was about absolute power over another human being's body, identity, and future. In her case, beauty became another resource to be exploited, something that increased her value to owners while stripping her of safety and autonomy. Her experience highlights a form of violence that often remains unspoken silent violence. This was not always public whippings or chains, but isolation, psychological control, sexual exploitation, and the constant fear of punishment. Enslaved women, especially those kept in private homes, suffered in ways that left few visible scars and even fewer records. Their pain was hidden, normalized, and dismissed as a private matter. The fascination surrounding her also reveals society's complicity. People whispered about her beauty and mystery, yet rarely questioned why a woman had to be hidden, controlled, and erased. Curiosity replaced outrage. In this way, the legend reflects how entire communities benefited from and emotionally distanced themselves from cruelty, allowing injustice to continue without resistance. A story also challenges romanticized narratives of the past. New Orleans is often remembered for its culture, music, and elegance, but her life forces us to confront the darker foundation beneath that beauty. The same wealth and refinement that fueled art and celebration were built on suffering that was carefully concealed. Keynote 9 reminds us that her story is not just about one woman, it is about a system that turned human traits into liabilities and silence into policy. By understanding what her life represents, we gain a clearer, more honest view of slavery as a structure of power that thrived not only on physical force, but on secrecy, desire, and collective denial. More than a century later, her story continues to disturb and captivate people around the world. This is not simply because of her beauty or the unanswered questions about her fate, but because her mystery reflects patterns that still exist in human society. Power, exploitation, silence, and erasure did not end with slavery, they only changed their forms. Her story feels uncomfortably familiar, which is why it refuses to fade. Modern audiences are drawn to unresolved histories because they expose gaps in official narratives. Her disappearance reminds us that history is often written by those with power, while the powerless are reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. When we cannot find records of her life or death, we are forced to confront how many stories like hers were never told, never recorded, and never acknowledged. The mystery also challenges how we consume tragic stories. There is a fine line between remembering and exploiting pain. Her legend asks us to reflect on whether fascination can unintentionally repeat the same patterns of objectification that harmed her in life. Are we honoring her humanity, or are we drawn only to the spectacle of her suffering? In a deeper sense, her story haunts us because it demands moral responsibility. We cannot change what happened to her, but we can choose how we remember. By questioning, discussing, and refusing to accept silence as an answer, we resist the final act of control that sought to erase her completely. Keynote 10 explains why this mystery endures. It is not about the past alone. It is a mirror held up to the present, reminding us that whenever power goes unchecked and voices are silenced, history has a way of repeating itself, and its ghosts continue to whisper until they are truly heard. In the end, the most important question is not whether every detail of her story can be proven, but whether we remember her as a human being. Legends tend to flatten lives into symbols, beauty, tragedy, mystery, while stripping away emotion, fear, and individuality. Behind every rumor about her was a real woman who felt pain, hope, confusion, and terror, even if history never recorded her voice. Remembering her means resisting the same forces that erased her. Slavery worked by denying personhood, changing names, breaking families, and reducing lives to ownership. When we speak of her only as the most beautiful slave, or as a curiosity, we risk continuing that erasure. To remember her properly is to acknowledge that her beauty was irrelevant compared to her humanity. This keynote also asks us to broaden our remembrance beyond her alone. She represents countless enslaved women whose stories were never whispered, never mythologized, and never questioned. For every legend that survived, thousands of lives disappeared without a trace. Honoring her should lead us to honor them as well, by recognizing the everyday suffering that did not make headlines or folklore. Modern remembrance is an act of justice. By telling her story with care, honesty, and respect, we challenge historical silence and refuse to let exploitation be transformed into entertainment. We replace fascination with empathy and mystery with moral clarity. Keynote 11 reminds us that history is not only about facts, it is about responsibility. When we remember her as a person rather than a myth, we restore something that slavery tried to destroy: dignity. And in doing so, we ensure that her story serves not as a spectacle, but as a warning and a call to human understanding. Her story ultimately leaves us with a lesson more powerful than any confirmed fact. Silence is never neutral. The mystery surrounding her life was created not by accident, but by a system that benefited from secrecy. Every missing record, every unanswered question, and every erased detail reflects a deliberate choice to protect power rather than truth. Slavery depended on silence to survive. It required people to look away, to whisper instead of speak, and to accept injustice as normal. Her life shows what happens when an individual is trapped inside that silence, how a human being can be reduced to a rumor, then to nothing at all. Even after her disappearance, the silence continued, attempting to deliver the final erasure, but the survival of her story, however fragmented, proves that silence can fail. Memory has a way of resisting control. Each retelling, each question, and each attempt to understand her life reclaims a small piece of what was taken from her. The truth may be incomplete, but the act of seeking it is itself a form of justice. This keynote also places responsibility on us, the modern audience. How we engage with stories like hers matters. We can consume them as dark entertainment, or we can treat them as moral testimonies. Choosing the second path means listening carefully, questioning power, and refusing to let fascination replace compassion. Keynote 12 closes the story not with answers, but with accountability. Her mystery teaches us that when voices are silenced, it is the duty of later generations to listen harder. By remembering her with honesty and empathy, we transform a story born from oppression into a lasting reminder. History's greatest horrors are sustained by silence and challenged by remembrance.